Guys, welcome. Thank you for joining us today on the show. Thanks for popping in. I've been very keen to talk to you guys about all things crypto art and NFTs, and it's the big talk of the town. How did you guys get into the field, both in the sort of digital field? Denise, how did you start?
Well, I got into, started to become more interested in blockchain more generally speaking. When I was still living in Sydney, I was doing a postdoc at a lab at UNSW that was focused on collaborations between computer science and visual arts,
Right.
or contemporary arts. And so through that, I started to do a bit of reading around the topic of blockchain, and it seemed in one sense something incredibly banal. I was like, how can this possibly be that interesting? But a lot of people were getting excited. So I kept on digging and started to get to know some of the community in that space, working in that space in Sydney, and started to get to know some of the interesting experiments that were happening internationally in this field, and wondered whether that might be more relevant to the kind of work that artists are making in Australia as well. So that was where it started, I suppose, back in 2018. And here we are now, in amongst much hype after
A lot
the
of
Christie's.
hype.
Yeah,
Yeah.
big Christie's sale.
Yeah, the Christie sale, all these music artists are now getting onto it. What do you think of that hype? Is that kind of the direction it's going?
Well, it's interesting because there's been lots of hype in the crypto space since, its inception, since 2008, Satoshi white paper. There's been a lot of excitement about this idea of being able to create another form of money, to create alternative economies. And so, hype and excitement can be a really good thing. It gets people experimenting, it gets people exploring, it gets people asking questions. But I think this latest wave of hype is more about it kind of mainstreaming almost, that there have been people since very early stages of the technology, since, things kicked off in 2008. So, 2014, Rob Myers, he was experimenting in this field already. And likewise, programs coming out of further field in London, that now there's a sort of, arguably a shift in tone, because for a long time, blockchain, cryptocurrency, all things in that space were really associated with, hackers, cyberpunks, people in that space. Now we have an auction house like Christie's, jumping onto that it's, I don't know, it's maybe a little bit like mum joining Facebook as well. It's kind of like, it shows that the tech has got to that. It's got to that stage, right?
And Jess, how about you? You've been on the other side of the coin to Denise, producing some digital art for a long time.
Yeah, so I'm a digital artist. I work mostly with augmented reality now. I've been working with augmented reality since about 2016, and I got into the sort of crypto space when I was invited to take part in the Blocumenta Blockathon that Denise organised in Sydney, which I think was 2019. Yeah. So I met a lot of people there, and it was a really interesting opportunity to sort of expand the circle that I usually work in, meeting a lot of developers and hackers and people from other sorts of spaces coming together, and it sort of all kicked off from there.
Yeah, awesome. And are you as excited as everyone else about NFTs being in that world?
I am. I think, there is a lot of excitement and hype surrounding that space, but the sort of conversations that I've also been part of recently have talked a lot about the environmental impacts and a lot of concern about that aspect of NFTs. So that's why I haven't yet dived in and created my own NFT just yet, because I'm still assessing all the options and making sure that the choice that I make is the right one for me. I think Denise might know better as well that there's a lot of different platforms at the moment, and some consume a lot more power than others. So,
yeah, right. But before we get too much further, I've got to ask the question I'm sure you've been asked many times: what is an NFT? What is blockchain? Do you have a go-to analogy to explain it, or that you always resort to, or how do you explain it?
Well, I guess there are a number of analogies that you could use, but because it is a very sort of technical field, I'm sort of hesitant to try and oversimplify it too much. But I suppose in a basic sense, blockchain, which is the underpinning technology for cryptocurrencies, and then NFTs, which aren't cryptocurrencies. They stand for non-fungible tokens. So they're almost like the kind of cousin to a cryptocurrency. They use the same kind of technology, but they use it for non-fungible. So that means non-mutually interchangeable items, so unique items. So artworks are a great example of what you might say is a unique item. And so blockchain is the underpinning sort of architecture or infrastructure for storing information. And if you think about the way in which data information is stored on a lot of the services we use, so let's say big cloud services like Google Drive, that many of us use, those servers are administered by a single company. And when we have access to those documents, we request permission to that and we gain access to it, but there's a centralized control of that information. The idea with blockchain and where it becomes more robust for things like, robust against things like hacking or arguably the kind of power and control around the information is more distributed, is because the information isn't just stored on one particular server. It's stored in blocks along a chain of many, many computers, so across a major network. So that means, what's recorded on it it's spread across an entire infrastructure, and so it is very, very, very difficult to change, which is where you get that idea of the records being immutable, what they say, you can't change them. And because they can't be changed, then people, there's a sense that they are more trustworthy, that we know that someone isn't going in the back end because it's convenient to them and just, changing the information. Oh, actually, there's more money. Yes, something like that. So that's probably, I guess, without going into too much detail.
It was. And then NFTs fit into that. NFTs fit into that. It's the way that you purchase and buy them, but the actual artwork isn't based on the blockchain. Is that right?
Yeah. So the whole thing with storing information on a blockchain is that it's, as Jess was saying already, very energy intensive, and there's a cost to it. There's a whole thing called gas fees, which may or may not, So what people are talking about in the NFT space is being able to basically have an immutable record of the work and its ownership. And what is kind of, I guess, nifty, as they say about NFTs, is that they're programmable. So if you are an artist and you create an NFT for your work, it functions a little bit like a kind of, permanent record of selling your work. But what you can also do is embed things like program resale royalties to return to you every time that particular work is sold. So that's where it's sort of, in a lot of ways, it's not necessarily developing functions that are entirely new, but it is automating and digitizing those things. So we have, for a long time, through commercial galleries, used things like limited editions to be able to create a sense of scarcity to the digital object. And it would be the gallery's responsibility to make sure that only this many versions of this video work were sold. And then, there were, broadly speaking, lots of conversations about how, copyright agencies can manage resale royalties, all those different things for use of images of work. And the idea is that with something like a blockchain or NFT system, you could sort of integrate many of those functions into a platform or a programmable system and make it, effectively sort of cut out a lot of intermediaries who would normally be involved in those processes.
And I guess as an artist in the digital space, it's long been, I don't know, maybe it's been a problem about it's so easy to distribute any piece of art around that people tend to not value it. They tend to think, it's just a free, thing on my phone. Do you think that's one of the big game changers here for artists?
Yeah, I think that, for a long time, for digital artists at least, if you were selling JPEGs or something like that, people would not value it as much and sort of think of it as a wallpaper on your phone or desktop background or something like that. And I think that this is a really interesting space because it's actually giving value to and an easy way to purchase those sorts of digital works. Like for my work in particular, making augmented reality, part of the work is that I want it to be quite accessible for people. So I create augmented reality on phones and those sorts of devices. You can sell augmented reality if you sell people a headset with something built in, but I think for me personally, it's the first time that there may be a way that I can actually sell this kind of work. And I guess what you were sort of saying before about intermediaries is quite interesting, because what I've been thinking, and my question for Denise is, because you're a curator and you are an intermediary in some sense, how do you feel like NFTs are going to change the way a curator works, or what sort of influence they have on developing collections of digital work?
Yeah, it's a good question actually. And I think it's interesting because in terms of intermediaries, there's always interactions between many intermediaries. And I think sometimes in the blockchain space, one of the things that we think is that when you get rid of a human intermediary, there is no intermediary. But in actual fact, I guess, like as you were mentioning before, the different platforms that you might choose to use, behind them are all people who are designing a product, who you are then sort of purchasing from. And so I guess one thing that we always think about is that when we're moving towards a technological intermediary, or those kinds of, those services, that actually implies a whole lot of other people and humans usually who have a stake in that. And a lot of the time what's challenging is that, to have a level of digital literacy where you're able to interrogate all the dimensions of those technological intermediaries is really challenging. I mean, I don't know many people who can go into the back end of a system like Makerspace or OpenSea and feel like they know with total authority, they have total control. So I think what's interesting is that if it was to actually get to a stage where there was such wholesale digital literacy and competence and confidence, that there was no need for any intermediaries because everyone could advocate for themselves and then to some degree I'd be like, well, that's great if I'm not needed and the work still happens and people can do great things. But I guess we're quite a long way from that, because I think the technology is moving a lot faster than communities are able to keep up with it. And so in a lot of cases, I see my role as sort of being someone who can come in, potentially alongside these intermediaries and say, look, these are some interesting platforms. These are the ways that they work. These are the advantages, the disadvantages. These are the things you might want to be aware of, the environmental aspects, the other kinds of socio-political implications. And then we can all make those decisions together. But yeah, that question of whether we're able to get to a point where there are no intermediaries, that would be a totally fully automated, maybe Skynet kind of.
Well, I just feel like it's so interesting because I feel like as a digital artist, like all of a sudden a lot of work that I've seen online for some time has sort of become mainstream, and I feel like almost like the aesthetic of contemporary art is changing in terms of what's dominant because of how NFTs have come about. And I just think it's really fascinating.
Yeah, it is, because I guess, and I think one of the big things that comes out, I think, from people who are particularly, coming from that crypto sphere is that they would argue that NFTs are able to sort of resist or push against some of the gatekeeping that has been a part of the sort of contemporary culture. And it's difficult because obviously one person's gatekeeper is another person's, connoisseur, an expert who's invested a lot of time. And I guess one of the things that came out of the Blocumenta conversation that we had, that big open forum we had, was about that question of imagining an entirely democratized culture. And how things like taste or value, how we assign value to things, whether the fact that currently we often let's say if it's in a gallery context, will recognise people's expertise, their investment, the knowledge that they've accumulated in an area, and sort of turn to that to be able to guide some decisions. Whereas I guess, as you say, when you go onto a platform like OpenSea or the NFT space, you get a sense of it being like really anything goes. And so, for some that is maybe, that can be a positive thing, but it can also be potentially, a challenging thing or something that means that you're sifting through a lot of work without getting, the guidance that a curator or an expert might be able to lend to say, well, I recognise in this work something that's very distinctive and original and it's connected to this history and,
Yeah.
And speaking of that sort of democratised world we might be heading towards, do you think that's going to be good? We're hearing a lot about all these $1 million sales, and it's often known that artists at the top can earn a lot of money, but the ones down below struggle to make a living. Do you think NFTs will be a way for that to kind of spread out the way to earn money and make a living out of this sort of stuff?
I think at this point it's still really hard to say. I think that, artists still will need to develop and cultivate a following and fans to sort of have sales and make money in that way. I think really it has, like, unfortunately in some ways sort of replicated some of the bad parts of the traditional art world, in that you do have some people who are making a lot of money and then other people who are not. That may change in the future. I think it depends on how the actual platforms develop and how we change how we sell things.
Yeah.
Because I guess, with, Beeple, who was at, the Big Christie's sale, he has a very, very significant social media following as it is. And I think he's done, he's made work for a number of sort of pop stars as well, so like Rihanna and stuff like that. So he's had a kind of celebrity cachet and had cultivated that kind of that image or that brand for himself as well. So it's different. I think most people from, sort of, an art historical or, contemporary art history background would look at Beeple's work and say, well, this has definitely got not much to do with the art world that I know. But then people coming more from a kind of, creative production sort of background would see that, this is kind of similar to the kinds of aesthetic that we see coming out of other forms of cultural practice. And I think that's one of the, interesting things there, is that it's, for a long time we've thought of those big sales as being part of just an art world thing. But now it's all forms of digital culture. The first tweet that was ever made is now an NFT.
And a lot of sports videos as well.
Yeah.
People are selling those.
So
they're
it's really,
trading cards and it's getting everything.
it's broadening that sense of valuable collectives.
Valuable culture.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of taken some of the concepts that we would normally associate just with, primary and secondary art market stuff, and is like spreading it.
Well, and on the sort of following, Jess, you've done a lot of work where it is kind of directly on those social media platforms with the face filters and stuff. How did you get involved with those?
Well, like I said, I started creating augmented reality in about 2016. At first I was creating sort of apps that were for iPhone, where people could try out different augmented reality experiences, draw in a 3D space, that sort of thing. And then I was actually invited to take part in the Instagram's beta program to be developing these sorts of filters. So I was one of the people, one of 300 people who had early access. So I got to try out the software before a lot of other people did. And I just loved how accessible it made the work. So I've been working almost primarily in that medium since then. Yeah.
And the sort of the nature of those filters is that you create them, and then the user is also sort of part of the art, a part of creating the art in a way. How's that been to see people kind of at taking what you've done and putting their own spin on things and using it in different ways?
It's been amazing, actually. I think it's a really unique art form in that it requires a person not to just look at it and think about it, but to actually put themselves in the picture frame and actually be part of the artwork in a way. I love looking at how people are developing their own sense of selves on the internet and putting different senses of self out there. And I'm interested in really creating creative tools that allow people to do that. And like I said, it's really important to me that a lot of the work is available for free. So currently the way I work as an artist is that I put a lot of things out there for free, and then sometimes I'll collaborate with brands or organisations or institutions and create something that they've commissioned, which will go on their Instagram account and that they can share with their audience. So for me, yeah, NFTs allow me to maybe explore a different way of working.
Yeah. And have you gone further down that route yet? Are you looking at putting out anything?
Yeah. So I think the platform that I'm leaning towards, and I really do apologise if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, but Hic et Nunc.
Oh.
Do you know how to say that? I don't know either. It's HIC and then ET and then NUC.
Right.
Yeah. They seem to be the most environmentally friendly platform for NFTs, but still, it's not negated. So yeah, I'm still looking into it. Also potentially looking at maybe starting some sort of platform where you could actually release only face filters and sell those sorts of things online. And I've been talking with a few people about that. So things in the works.
Oh, cool. Well, I was thinking whether actually Canberra in some ways is a good place to start something like this. I guess the difficulty with any system being distributed is that obviously it means that there's less control over where the sources of energy are coming from in terms of the ecological aspects, but whether Canberra is an interesting place because of the kind of commitment towards renewable energy, whether starting some kinds of platforms here and building up with a small network of participants here would be like an interesting way to sort of also make the most or sort of illustrate that there can be a kind of working towards a greener form of experimenting in these technologies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because might explain the what's the reason for this large amount of energy spent with NFTs? It's kind of running the blockchain, basically. Is that right?
Yeah, it's because every transaction that takes place has to be verified. And I think that the more transactions that are made, the more transactions that have to be verified again. And I think that maybe when these sorts of blockchains were started, they weren't used by a huge number of people, so maybe that wasn't a consideration. But as more and more people are using them and they become more popular, it's more of a problem.
There are other kinds of decentralized ledger technologies though that I guess are coming out of it as well. Like the biggest, most energy intensive blockchain is Bitcoin, like the original. And so it means that it's very difficult for a lot of people to work with it because it's slow as well, right? So Ethereum is the blockchain that probably most artists work with, and certainly a lot of the NFTs are built on the Ethereum blockchain. But there are other kinds of things like holochain, which are sort of like meant to be sort of localized, less intensive versions and sort of more localized community approaches to having a similar principle to blockchain, but allowing it to not be quite as gargantuan, something like Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like such a promising thing, but you don't want to be having all these servers around the world kind of just burning with what people will perceive as a waste of time sort of product, I guess. And you both do a fair bit of work at the universities here in Canberra. What's the the mood amongst students with this stuff and in where you're working?
Well, interestingly, I think, you know, a lot of people talk about these technologies being particularly appealing to a younger audience. And certainly when it comes to something like cryptocurrency, you know, I think in one of the earlier kind of boom moments, there were a lot of younger traders. I mean, you have to be over 18 to be able to trade in cryptocurrency, to be able to use something like BTC markets and get some. But I guess the interesting thing is still there are substantial barriers even for younger people to be able to participate in these things, mainly technological but also financial. So I think there's excitement but still a lot of questions. A lot of students who also would wonder, you know, is this just hype? Also that they might sometimes with any particular technology, certain subcultures can form. You've probably heard the term, and it just, you know, crypto bro, that kind of thing that can put off a lot of people. And it can be a kind of self-fulfilling thing as well, because there are a bunch of people with that particular subculture there, and it you know puts other people off from joining. So I think that there's probably curiosity, but what I think is always good is curiosity and experimentation is fantastic, as long as it's always paired with a kind of critical engagement and a thinking about, as you said, Jess, you know, if the aim is democratization, are we ensuring that it's accessible, or what kind of barriers might we unknowingly sort of erect by going down this particular path?
I think as well, I've noticed that some apps, and I can't remember exactly which ones, but some apps are sort of allowing you to invest in cryptocurrency, like as a, I don't know if it was Robinhood, but, you know, where you sort of do a roundup and you put very small amounts of money into cryptocurrencies. I don't know if those sorts of things are available for young people or if there's ways around that.
Yeah, I'm sure there's ways around. There's usually ways around.
Just putting a different date of birth.
Yeah, exactly.
I know.
Seems to do it most of the time.
Exactly, the official line versus what actually happens.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the interesting thing as well, though, about, you know, crypto, is that because it enables a really strong protection of anonymity, there's a lot that we don't know about people in this sphere. You know what they might choose to present to us, but the whole KYC, you know, your customer aspect of cryptocurrency is what a lot of, you know, governments and other organizations have been concerned about, because, you know, there's lots of marvelous aspects about protecting privacy, but then also it means that, you know, we could be, oh my God, actually hanging out with a bunch of 17-year-olds this whole time when we thought that they were, you know, 45.
And Jess, your kind of field is an interesting one because it's combining the arts and sort of the science and tech side of things. How's that been navigating both sides? I know you're also studying at ANU in a kind of not common field. How's that been?
It's good. So I'm doing a PhD in neuroscience. Look, I think a lot of the people that I talk to about this sort of thing maybe do come from a more tech-based side, but I'm not sure if that makes them more likely to, I guess, jump in than anyone else. Maybe it's just the sort of people I'm friends with. It really just depends. I think it's going to be very much an age thing. I think the sort of people that I hang around with in, you know, that department are maybe older. There's not a lot of young people, students there. It's all postgrads. So I don't think it's a good reflection of what is going on. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you just have a distinction between when you're doing the art side of things and when you're doing the tech side of things, or is it kind of all mixed, melded in together?
For a long time there was a distinction, and now there's not really. It's all just sort of one thing.
Yeah.
And I'll be working on different projects at different times of the day, and it's all the same sort of creative and scientific sort of input there.
And we can touch on to the neuro at the ANU's in trouble.
Oh,
Have
yes.
you got any updates for us?
Please save neuroscience. No, I don't have any updates at this stage. At the moment, it's just a proposal of what they're planning to do.
Okay.
The submissions period has closed. So I think the university now is going to be reviewing all the submissions and then making a decision.
Yeah. And what's your work there about?
So I study visual perception in humans. So we look at how people can perceive their environment and different things in their environment and different surfaces and textures. And we look at that in both healthy populations and people with different sorts of neurodegenerative diseases.
Yeah, amazing. No, thank you so much for coming in. I know a lot of people are going to be interested in this, so it's great to hear from some people in town doing this sort of stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.